Breaking. It happened in total silence, then everything exploded. A Russian military train, loaded with tanks, fuel, and ammunition, rolled confidently across what Moscow believed was a secured supply corridor. But what they didn't know was that Ukraine had been waiting, tracking every movement for days. And in a single, terrifying instant, the night sky lit up like a burning sunrise. The sound of the explosion echoed for miles, shaking windows, waking up villages, and sending Russian soldiers into pure panic. This wasn't just another strike. This was a trap, planned with surgical precision, and it hit right at the heart of Russia's supply network. For months, this railway had been Russia's lifeline to the front, stretching from Belgorod down toward Donetsk, carrying food, fuel, and munitions. Every day, dozens of trains crossed it under heavy guard. Moscow called it untouchable. Russian state media proudly showed images of the trains rumbling forward, filled with supplies for the troops fighting in eastern Ukraine. They said Ukraine would never dare to strike here. But last night, that illusion was shattered. Ukrainian intelligence had studied satellite images, drone feeds, and intercepted communications. They knew the schedule, the cargo, even the names of the officers on board. And when the moment came, they were ready. The footage that's now circulating online, grainy, shot from a drone, shows the Russian train slowing as it enters a narrow section of track surrounded by forests. Everything looks calm. Then, within seconds, the rails beneath it detonate. The front locomotive is lifted off the ground like a toy. Flames burst from the fuel wagons. One explosion triggers another. And within half a minute, the entire train turns into a rolling inferno. The shockwave is so powerful it blows the trees sideways. A column of fire climbs hundreds of feet into the night sky. The ground trembles. And then, for a moment, total silence again, broken only by the distant sound of secondary detonations. Russian soldiers nearby ran for their lives, abandoning vehicles and radio equipment. Some tried to contain the blaze, but it was too late. Ammunition wagons began cooking off, launching debris like rockets in every direction. Within an hour, what had been a proud logistical artery of the Russian army was reduced to twisted metal and burning craters. Early reports suggest that over 24 cars were destroyed, and at least 50 Russian troops were caught in the blast zone. The train had been carrying thousands of artillery shells and fuel barrels, critical for frontline operations near Avdiivka. Now, all of it is gone. Russian channels went silent for hours. Then, one after another, panicked messages started to leak. A local governor admitted there had been a railway incident. State TV called it a technical malfunction, but independent sources say it was an ambush, a coordinated attack using precision-guided mines planted days earlier, remotely activated when the train entered the trap. Ukrainian officials, as usual, neither confirmed nor denied. But one senior officer hinted cryptically, "The rails remember who rides them." Across social media, the footage went viral in minutes. Hashtags like #RussianTrain and #Ukrainian ambush exploded across Telegram and X. Russian military bloggers, usually quick to brag about Moscow's strength, fell silent or deleted their posts. Even pro-Kremlin commentators admitted this was a catastrophic breach. And for good reason. That railway wasn't just a transport line, it was one of the few remaining arteries connecting Russian supply depots with their forces in eastern Ukraine. Losing it means rerouting through smaller, slower paths, hundreds of kilometers away. It means fuel shortages, delayed reinforcements, hungry soldiers waiting for supplies that may never arrive. In Moscow, the atmosphere turned grim. Late at night, Putin's advisors reportedly gathered for an emergency briefing. No one could explain how Ukraine had known the exact timing of the convoy. No one could guarantee it wouldn't happen again. For the first time, Russian media used the word that the Kremlin hates most: vulnerable. Every Russian rail line suddenly looked like a target. Every cargo, every train driver, every soldier on logistics duty started to wonder if they'd be next. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the mood was very different. A quiet sense of satisfaction spread through the ranks. Ukrainian officers called it textbook warfare, a strike that required patience, precision, and perfect timing. Months of reconnaissance, countless hours of drone observation, and one single button press at the perfect second. The result? A billion-ruble disaster for Russia, achieved without a single Ukrainian soldier needing to cross enemy lines. Military analysts are calling it one of the most devastating logistical strikes since the beginning of the war. "This isn't just a train," said one NATO advisor. "It's a symbol of how Ukraine now owns the night." The operation showcased a new level of sophistication, intelligence, coordination, timing, and psychological warfare combined into one brutal message. Russia's supply lines are not safe anywhere. And that's the real story here. Not just the flames, not just the destruction, but what it means. Because behind that burning train lies a deeper truth. Russia's entire war machine depends on fragile routes like this one. One by one, they're being hunted down. One by one, Ukraine is cutting the veins that feed the front. But the question now is, how could Russia let this happen? How did Ukrainian forces track, predict, and strike such a heavily guarded convoy without being detected? And what does this mean for Moscow's next move? Is this the moment the balance of the war begins to shift when Russia realizes it can't protect its own infrastructure anymore? It began weeks before the explosion. Ukrainian intelligence had been watching that railway line for months, quietly mapping every inch of track, every tunnel, every guard post. From the air, it looked like just another steel vein stretching through the Russian-occupied zone. But to Kyiv's military planners, it was more than that. It was the lifeline of an entire front. Through it came the food, the fuel, the ammunition that kept Russia's armies alive. Without it, entire divisions would grind to a halt. And so the plan was simple: wait, watch, and strike at the precise moment when it would hurt the most. They called it Operation Black Smoke. A small team of Ukrainian special operators, trained in sabotage and electronic warfare, slipped through the tree line under cover of darkness. Satellite intel from NATO had shown them the exact coordinates where the terrain forced the railway to curve tightly through a wooded ravine, a place where the train would have to slow down. It was the perfect kill zone. Using equipment no larger than a laptop, they planted remote-controlled mines under the rails, each packed with enough explosive force to tear through an armored train car. The charges were disguised to look like parts of the track itself, invisible even to thermal scans. Then they waited. Days passed. The first trains came and went, supply runs, empty transports, decoys, but the team stayed silent. Patience was part of the mission. They waited for the train, the one carrying high-value cargo, and on that night, it finally appeared on satellite radar. Dozens of wagons, most loaded with tank engines and artillery shells, escorted by soldiers and armored vehicles. The Russians were confident, almost arrogant. They believed Ukraine's sabotage network had been wiped out months ago. That confidence would cost them everything. As the train entered the ravine, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones high above relayed a coded message. Cargo confirmed. That was the signal. The command post miles away gave a single word over the encrypted channel: execute, and then detonation. The result was instantaneous chaos. Fire erupted along the entire length of the train. The fuel wagons turned into giant torches, lighting up the forest like a second sunrise. The drones captured every second, the heat wave rolling across the trees, the shock wave flattening everything nearby, the soldiers running in confusion, their radios filled with static. When Russian rescue teams finally arrived hours later, they found nothing left but twisted metal and molten rails. The blaze was so intense it melted the steel beams of a nearby bridge. The explosion crater was 20 meters wide. Forensic investigators quietly admitted what the Kremlin refused to. This was no accident. It was a precision-planned ambush. And the timing couldn't have been worse. That train was carrying supplies meant for 2 Russian brigades entrenched near Donetsk units, already suffering shortages. Without that shipment, they'd run out of shells within days. But the blast did more than destroy a train. It shattered confidence. Across occupied territories, Russian logistics officers began refusing to travel by rail. Drivers panicked. Supply depots demanded extra security. Moscow ordered emergency rerouting through slower roads that couldn't handle the same capacity. Within 48 hours, supply deliveries to several frontline sectors had dropped by more than half. Ukrainian artillery units seized the opportunity. They launched rapid offensives on newly weakened Russian positions, knowing their enemy was running on fumes. Russian soldiers at the front started recording desperate voice messages to their families, pleading for fuel, food, or extraction. "We have nothing left," one voice said. "They told us resupply would come yesterday." It didn't. Some commanders reportedly broke radio silence to complain directly to Moscow. But in the Kremlin, confusion reigned. Putin's generals blamed regional logistics officers, who in turn accused security services of failing to protect the tracks. The atmosphere was pure chaos, finger-pointing, panic, and fear of punishment. The once vaunted image of an unstoppable Russian war machine began to crack from within. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials stayed quiet. President Zelensky didn't even mention the incident by name in his address that night. He simply said, "Our defenders know when to strike. And they do it with precision." But behind closed doors, Western intelligence confirmed that this was one of the most successful sabotage missions of the war, executed entirely with Ukrainian coordination and minimal external input. It was proof that Kyiv no longer needed large-scale offensives to break Russia's momentum. A single, well-timed strike could do more damage than 1,000 artillery shells. The psychological effect was immense. Russian soldiers began scanning the skies for drones, even during routine transport missions. Civilians in border regions started reporting every train noise as an attack. Social media filled with unverified videos of explosions, some real, some imagined. Panic had spread faster than the flames. The Kremlin censorship machine tried to contain it, ordering state media to call the incident an electrical fire. But when satellite images showing the burned wreckage began appearing on independent channels, that narrative collapsed instantly. And there was another layer to this disaster, one that Moscow hadn't yet realized. The destroyed train wasn't just carrying supplies, it also transported encrypted communications equipment, linking several frontline command posts. Losing that gear meant losing real-time coordination across 3 major divisions. For nearly 12 hours after the blast, Russian units were effectively blind. Ukrainian forces exploited the blackout, moving artillery units closer to the front, hitting depots and ammo dumps that no longer had working defenses. What started as one explosion quickly turned into a domino effect across the entire region. By morning, even loyal Russian commentators on state television looked shaken. One presenter asked bluntly, "How could this happen on Russian-controlled territory?" Another, visibly nervous, suggested that internal leaks may have guided the Ukrainian strike. The idea terrified the Kremlin, because if that were true, it meant betrayal from within. And in wartime Russia, betrayal is worse than defeat. But the true nightmare was still unfolding. Reports came in that the backup supply line, the secondary railway further east, had also been hit by unexplained sabotage. Suddenly, 2 key routes were down. Fuel convoys stalled, entire battalions stranded. Russia's logistic system was collapsing in real time. And as the smoke still rose from the burning wreckage, another question began echoing across Moscow. If Ukraine could strike so deep, so precisely, and so silently, what else could they reach next? Because for the first time since the war began, the Kremlin realized this wasn't just about territory anymore. It was about control. And right now, Ukraine had it. But the most shocking reaction wasn't from Russia. It came from abroad, from NATO itself. And what happened next caught even Moscow off guard. The explosion hadn't even cooled before the shockwaves reached Moscow's corridors of power. Inside the Kremlin, reports poured in, minute by minute, burning fuel cars, missing soldiers, broken communications, and entire divisions cut off. What began as a single strike on a railway line had now snowballed into a full-blown logistical collapse. The Russian military machine, once feared for its scale, was bleeding from the inside. And for the first time since the war began, no one in Moscow could pretend everything was under control. At first, Russian officials tried to play it down. A technical malfunction, one state spokesman muttered during a late-night broadcast, his face pale, voice trembling. But behind the scenes, intelligence officers were panicking. Satellite intercepts from Western agencies later revealed what those secret meetings were like: chaos, shouting, maps covered in red marks, and generals desperately calling for reroutes that simply didn't exist. The once booming war trains had stopped. The entire front line was starving of supplies. NATO intelligence centers in Brussels and London were watching it all unfold in real time. The Ukrainian strike was so precise, so surgical, that even Western analysts were astonished. This was not luck, one British defense advisor said. It was discipline, coordination, and mastery of intelligence warfare. Within hours, NATO's command quietly confirmed that Ukrainian forces had pulled off one of the most complex coordinated ambushes of the entire war without direct Western targeting assistance. The message was clear. Ukraine was now capable of operating independently, at a level that rivaled major Western militaries. The White House released a short statement praising Ukraine's growing defensive capabilities, while carefully avoiding any mention of the attack itself. But in Europe, the reaction was far less restrained. German and Polish news outlets splashed the footage of the burning train across their headlines. British tabloids called it the inferno that split Russia's supply artery. In Kyiv, military officials didn't deny their involvement, they simply smiled. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry's official X account posted a single image. A shattered stretch of railway line glowing red in the night with the caption, "Precision has no borders." Meanwhile, inside Russia, the mood was collapsing. Panic swept through the logistics network. Thousands of train engineers, fearing another ambush, refused to travel through contested zones. Some even resigned, posting farewell videos online, saying they didn't sign up to die on rails. Military convoys jammed the highways, trying to replace the broken train routes, only to become easy targets for Ukrainian drones. Footage emerged of Russian supply trucks burning on open roads, abandoned by their drivers. Every explosion deepened the sense that the Russian army was fighting ghosts it couldn't see, couldn't predict, couldn't stop. Putin's inner circle, sources say, turned on each other almost instantly. Defense Minister Shoigu reportedly lashed out at intelligence chiefs for failing to anticipate the strike. The FSB, in turn, accused army officers of leaking information to Ukraine. Within days, 3 senior logistics officials were quietly dismissed. The Kremlin called it routine rotation. But to insiders, it was a purge, a frantic search for someone to blame. One former advisor described the mood bluntly. It's not a military command anymore, it's a panic room. And while Moscow descended into infighting, the ripple effect spread across the front. In occupied Donetsk, Russian soldiers were reportedly trading fuel for food. In Luhansk, units began rationing ammunition to 1 shell per hour. A captured Russian radio intercept, shared by Ukrainian intelligence, revealed a soldier begging his superior. "We can't fight like this. There's nothing left. The tracks are gone. The trucks are gone. We're waiting to die here." The despair in his voice was raw, human, and unmistakably real. This wasn't just a tactical failure, it was psychological collapse. Ukraine, on the other hand, seized the moment. With the Russian supply lines crippled, their forces launched a series of small but devastating counterattacks along the eastern corridor. They moved fast, striking isolated Russian positions before reinforcements could arrive. Each assault was swift, surgical, and filmed for propaganda purposes. Videos flooded social media, Ukrainian drones hovering above abandoned Russian outposts, flags being raised, soldiers shouting in triumph. The message was simple and loud: Russia can't hold the line. In NATO capitals, the tone shifted dramatically. Generals who had once urged caution now began speaking of opportunity. Pentagon briefings hinted that Ukraine was proving the viability of modern asymmetric warfare. Behind closed doors, Western allies approved a fresh wave of weapons support, including longer-range precision missiles. Officials no longer talked about defending Ukraine. They started using another phrase: reshaping the battlefield. Moscow heard it loud and clear, and it terrified them. Russian propaganda tried to fight back, flooding state TV with patriotic songs and clips of soldiers rebuilding the destroyed railway. But the footage looked staged, unconvincing. The contrast between glossy promises and smoldering reality was too glaring. Telegram channels lit up with posts from soldiers mocking their own government. "We're not an army," one wrote. "We're a funeral waiting to happen." Another said, "Every time we load a train, we wonder if it's the last one." The Kremlin could censor the news, but it couldn't censor the fear spreading through its own ranks. And then came the global response. The European Union announced a new sanctions package aimed at Russia's transport and energy sectors, explicitly targeting railway maintenance and logistics companies. The message was unmistakable. While Ukraine was destroying the trains, the West would make sure Russia couldn't rebuild them. China, Moscow's supposed ally, remained silent, refusing to comment, refusing to send replacement parts. That silence spoke volumes. The dominoes continued to fall. Energy markets panicked as reports emerged that the railway line had been carrying diesel bound for Russian power plants. Prices spiked. The ruble plunged again. Moscow's stock exchange froze trading for several hours, citing technical difficulties. But everyone knew what it meant. The war wasn't just draining Russia's military, it was eating its economy alive. For years, Putin had built his power on the image of control. Control of the army, of the media, of the nation itself. But control was slipping through his fingers. Each explosion, each burning train, each panicked soldier's message online was a reminder that the empire he built on fear was now being undone by precision and patience. And yet, amid all this chaos, one question remained unanswered, the one that even Western analysts couldn't agree on. How did Ukraine know exactly when and where to strike? Was it satellite intel? Was it insiders leaking coordinates from inside Russia's rail network? Or was it something more, an organized resistance within Russian territory itself, working hand in hand with Kyiv? Because if that last theory is true, it means the battlefield has already moved behind Russia's own borders, and that's a nightmare no propaganda can erase. But that's not even the end. What happened in the following days, how the panic spread, how Russia's own soldiers turned on each other, and how NATO's next move set the stage for a global confrontation would leave even the Kremlin speechless. By dawn, the fire from the destroyed train still burned, a thick pillar of black smoke twisting above the forest like a scar across the sky. But the real blaze was no longer on the rails, it was spreading through Russia itself. From the Ministry of Defense to the smallest military garrison, panic had infected every level of the system. No one knew what to believe. No one knew who to trust. And as the Kremlin scrambled to regain control, something unthinkable began to happen. Russia's own war machine started tearing itself apart from the inside. In the early hours, a leaked recording from inside the Russian Logistics Command Center hit Telegram. You could hear the voices frantic, disorganized, shouting over one another. "We've lost the main route," one officer yelled. Another responded, "The alternate line is compromised too." Then silence, and a third voice broke through. "Who gave them our schedule?" The implication was explosive. Someone had leaked the train's timetable, someone inside Russia. It was no longer just a war between two nations. It was a war with spies, betrayal, and fear eating away at Moscow's own heart. The Kremlin's immediate response was brutal. Dozens of officers were detained under suspicion of negligence and information leaks. The FSB stormed into railway control offices across Western Russia, confiscating documents, interrogating engineers, even arresting civilian workers. But instead of restoring order, it only fueled the chaos. Videos began circulating of soldiers turning on their own commanders, shouting about corruption and incompetence. "You sit in Moscow drinking tea while we die without ammo," one soldier screamed in a viral clip. It was quickly deleted, but not before millions saw it. Meanwhile, reports from the front lines grew worse by the hour. Russian artillery units were rationing shells. Tanks sat idle, out of fuel. Drone operators couldn't recharge their systems because the generators had run dry. Ukrainian forces pressed forward with precision strikes, hitting abandoned convoys and exposed bunkers. Every move looked effortless, like they knew exactly where to strike. And maybe they did. NATO surveillance was feeding Kyiv real-time imagery, and now, with Russia's communications shattered, there was nothing left to hide behind. By the third day, Moscow's propaganda machine lost its rhythm. Anchors stuttered on air, unsure of what to say. The usual confident tone was gone. One broadcast cut off mid-sentence when an explosion echoed outside the studio. It was later revealed to be a Ukrainian drone strike on an oil depot near Kursk. The panic was no longer just on the front. It was creeping into Russia's own cities. Fuel lines grew longer. Supermarket shelves emptied. Rumors spread that martial law would be declared nationwide. People began withdrawing cash, buying train tickets, fleeing west. But there was a cruel irony: many of the trains weren't running anymore. Western intelligence confirmed what Moscow tried to hide. Over 40% of Russia's military rail network had been temporarily shut down due to sabotage, damage, or security sweeps. Entire industrial regions were paralyzed. Freight trains loaded with grain, steel, and oil sat abandoned on the tracks. "It's not just an ambush," one NATO analyst said. "It's an infection. Ukraine struck one artery, and the shock has spread through the whole body. And that infection had reached the Kremlin." Behind closed doors, senior generals began whispering that Putin's leadership was faltering. Some proposed declaring a temporary ceasefire to reorganize supply lines. Others warned that doing so would look like surrender. The meetings turned toxic. One witness later described it as the sound of desperation, men who knew the empire they served was rotting beneath them. Rumors began to leak of power struggles, Shoigu arguing with Gerasimov, whispers of loyalty tests, secret meetings between the FSB and the Presidential Guard. The word mutiny floated through corridors like poison gas. Then came the international response. NATO called an emergency session in Brussels. Officials spoke carefully, avoiding any claim of direct involvement. But their message was unmistakable. Russia's rear vulnerability had been exposed. The U.S. confirmed a new military aid package for Ukraine, including advanced radar systems and deep strike munitions. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak declared that Russia's logistical collapse is proof that aggression cannot sustain itself. The Kremlin called it interference. The world called it reality. Even China, Russia's supposed ally, began to back away. Beijing abruptly cancelled a planned shipment of spare parts for Russian locomotives, citing supply concerns. To Moscow, it was humiliation. To Ukraine, it was vindication. The once proud alliance that Putin had bragged about on television was dissolving in front of the world's cameras. Russia was alone, isolated, bleeding, and turning inward. As the fires of the ambush train finally went out, a new kind of fire ignited a political one. In cities like Rostov, Belgorod, and even parts of Moscow, small protests began forming. Families of soldiers demanded answers. "Where are our sons?" they cried. "Why are they dying for broken trains and empty promises?" Riot police quickly moved in, but the images mothers being dragged through the streets, fathers shouting liars at officials spread like wildfire online. For every video the Kremlin tried to delete, 3 more appeared. The censorship wall was cracking. And in that chaos, Ukraine struck again, this time not with bombs, but with words. President Zelensky appeared on live television, addressing both Ukrainians and Russians. "We did not destroy your train," he said calmly. "You did when you believed lies instead of truth, when your leaders sent you to fight for a dream that burns on the tracks of your own land." The statement went viral across Russian social media, shared even by people who once supported the war. It was the final blow, not of force, but of faith. Economists inside Russia began warning that the state budget was imploding. With transport routes crippled and oil exports delayed, revenues plunged. The ruble nosedived again. By the end of the week, the Russian central bank quietly froze foreign exchange reserves to stop the bleeding. But no amount of control could fix what was broken. The foundation of Putin's power, fear, wealth, and the illusion of stability was disintegrating. And then came the moment that changed everything. Satellite images showed massive troop movements within Russia itself, not toward Ukraine, but around Moscow. Columns of armored vehicles, convoys of soldiers, checkpoints on highways. The Kremlin called it a security exercise. But everyone knew what it meant. The threat wasn't just at the border anymore. It was inside. The empire was preparing for a battle with itself. As the lights flickered across the capital and sirens wailed in the distance, one question echoed louder than the explosions, louder than the propaganda, louder than the lies. Was this the end of Russia's illusion of control? Was this how great powers fall not with invasion, but with implosion? And as the screen fades to black, the voice of the narrator cuts through the static. This was never just about one train. It was about the moment the wheels stopped turning and an empire began to break apart. If you think this was shocking, wait until you see what happens next, because the next phase of this war is already underway. And it's not just Russia that's about to feel the heat. Stay tuned, subscribe, and watch what's coming, because the world is about to change again. So the real story here isn't just about a train or an explosion. It's about a regime losing control of the very rails that keep its war alive. The question now is, how long until those rails snap completely? If you want to see what comes next, what Ukraine might target next, and how the West plans to squeeze Moscow even harder, make sure to like this video, share it, and subscribe. Because this story isn't fading out, what's coming could reshape the entire war. And now we want to hear from you. Was this the moment Russia's logistical backbone finally broke? Or is the Kremlin quietly preparing something even more desperate in return? Drop your thoughts below. I read every single comment, and the best ones will be featured in the next video. If you believe the world needs to see what's really happening behind Russia's collapsing supply lines, then don't just scroll away. Hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Because this war isn't slowing down, and the next strike could change everything. Turn on notifications, stay with us, and be part of this global community that follows the truth straight from the front line. This is Warland Stories, and we're just getting started.